Hello and welcome back to another episode of ReBooking to Mastery, presented by me, Jugging. And so, for you first time people who are tuning in, this is a podcast where I generally talk about books that I've read, analyzing some of the key lessons to learn, and pretty much what you can get out of the book um, with key insights and a brief description about the author. So, this podcast episode, however, is going to be something a little bit to the contrary. Instead of focusing on a book specifically, I want to focus on an application of the last book I just analyzed, The Obstacle is the Way, into more of a real life situation, using the principle of perception from that book. As a reminder, perception pretty much means looking at an obstacle, looking at some sort of reality. And there are two ways you can look at said reality. You can look at this reality in an objective format, or you can look at it in a subjective format. The subjective format entails viewing a situation with your preconceptions, your past, your first impressions, and your pretty much your overall ideology being based on stuff you've built up about a situation. And objective reality pretty much allows for and accounts for all of these preconceptions. However, it also views a situation as it is without letting them come in the way. The difference between subjective reality and objective reality is that your preconceptions, your preconditions, and whatever you've been defined by will define a situation, will define the way you look at something. However, an objective reality will not discount everything you've seen, will not discount your preconceptions, your biases, or your stereotypes. It will take them into account, but it will also not judge it based on that. And so, the one thing this can apply to is not only situations, but people. So there's a common phrase that a lot of us like fail to use or recognize sometimes. And it's the idea of fitting the narrative around the facts as opposed to fitting the facts around the narrative. And this is based on subjective and objective reality. So one thing we have an issue of doing is that especially once we have a positive impression, we have a good view or a certain view of someone, it's hard for us to change that, especially with further evidence provided to support our substantiated preconceptions. We look at a person, we look at a situation, we look at the way someone acts, and we assign characteristics to them. And with certain characteristics like being authentic, being open, being confident, other positive characteristics follow as well. And so when we find something or we see something that kind of differs in our analysis or our view of someone or a situation even, it's hard for us to accept it because we are so entranced in our preconceptions and beliefs that for us to acknowledge something new or see something new becomes much harder, and it becomes way more of a problem to do. So one thing we should always do is instead of taking our preconceptions and holding them as the foundation of whatever we know about a person and discounting anything that doesn't sound right in our box that we've established, we should be more fluid in our analysis of people. It's hard to accept and it's hard to see that people people do not show all of their personality. But for the most part, everyone walking around us is wearing some kind of a mask. They're wearing some kind of a mask that disguises their true personality, that disguises not necessarily their entire personality, but parts of them that they believe or that are like hidden deep inside of them. So one thing to always remember is that no matter how much you may think you know someone, there are parts of people you do not know. There are parts of situations you do not know. For instance, take a situation, say at work or in a situation with friends. Say you hear a second-hand or third-hand version of a story. Does that mean you know all the facts, all the feelings, all the perspectives? No. And the same thing applies to people themselves. Just because you know one side of someone, just because you feel like you know one side of one person, doesn't mean you know all of it, all of the sides or all of the things necessary. And so this leads into the idea of change. So a lot of people, they can see themselves taking the next step, becoming someone greater than themselves, or working to improve themselves overall, but they will not seek or look for the same things in other people. One fault we have as a society is that we expect ourselves to change, and we feel affronted, we feel offended when people do not acknowledge our change. But we do not look for the same change in other people as well. We find so that like the only people that can change, adapt, and become someone better is ourselves, not anyone else. We are the only ones who can learn from our mistakes, but no one else can. And so this kind of ties into the idea, the overall purpose of this is to show the idea of perception, or to show the idea of the obstacle is the way. That not only should you not judge a situation by preconceptions, or judge a person by your preconceptions or your first impressions, because more often than not, those preconceptions and first impressions are going to be wrong. It's also important to acknowledge that people can change. People can become better versions of themselves. And the only person that can change, the only person that can change is not restricted to just you. Everyone else around you can change and will adapt. And if as long as you know this, not only for in terms of a friendly rivalship between people or just as friends, it's important to acknowledge that people will adapt and overcome. You're not going to be the only one who does that. And it's hard for us to accept that. So, in summary, the purpose of this episode is just to show that do not judge, or rather, do not fit the facts around a narrative or a preconception or a belief you have of a situation or of a person, but rather assemble all the facts and then create the narrative based on that. And that'll serve you well in the long run. It'll stop you from making mistakes and judgments of character that are not necessarily true. And always acknowledge that people can and will change to become better versions of themselves. And to remove yourself from this individualistic or heroic individualism that a lot of people preach as the way to life. Because community is necessary for society, whether or not we acknowledge it. Thank you so much for tuning in to this mini offset of an episode regarding the paradox of change and the idea of facts versus narratives. Thank you so much, and see you next week for the next book that I will begin to analyze. Thank you. And if you'd like to follow me on all platforms, follow me at Mastery of the Minds on TikTok and Instagram, and check my podcast link below for other platforms. Thank you.